Hello everyone and welcome back to Shuvra Deb with you. And welcome to my new listeners. I'm so glad you've landed here. So today I am going to talk about public speaking, slightly different to the sorts of topics I normally talk about, but it's something that I wanted to share with you. And I have some great tips for you on how to improve your public speaking. But before we get into those tips, I want to offer a description of public speaking first. So the way I see it, public speaking is not just where you stand on a podium or on a stage in front of a large or small or medium-sized audience. I mean, it can be that, of course. For example, when you have a presentation or a speech or a presentation to deliver at a meeting, or you're part of a debating competition. But that's not the only description of public speaking. It's also something you do, perhaps without even realizing it. For example, when you're asking for a pay rise in a meeting with your boss. Public speaking is also when you're having some other kind of conversation where you're trying to persuade someone or a group of people of your point of view. If you're in sales and you're trying to sell a service or a product, well, guess what? You're also in public speaking. Public speaking is also your written work. If you're someone who writes or you have a job where you are required to write. And I bet most of you listening are in jobs where you need to write. Have you ever sent an email or a text message that's work-related? Right. So you get the picture. Public speaking is broad enough to encompass most forms of communication with most kinds of people. It's a form of communication that involves a presenter and an audience. It could be an audience of one or many. It could be you as a college student speaking to your parents and seeking their permission to go on an overseas school trip. It could be you as a parent speaking to your child, asking them to do something or to eat that broccoli on their plate. And so, the title of today's show is 3 ways to improve your public speaking, not just for speeches. The kind of public speaking that I am going to focus on in today's episode is the type, however, where you are in front of an audience delivering a talk, a presentation, or a workshop. But the tips I give to you today on this show are transferable, and you will be able to pull some of these skills and practices over to those other kinds of public speaking about which I just spoke. Okay, so there are 3 core areas that you need to pay attention to when you undertake public speaking in front of an audience. The first core area, and you may wish to pull out a piece of paper and a pen to make some notes. The first core area is purpose. What is the purpose of your talk? Are you there to entertain the audience, or are you there to inform the audience? Perhaps even you're there for a bit of both. The second core area is content. What are you going to say in your talk or presentation? Is it going to be formal and structured? Or are you going to take an approach where your talk is more information-driven versus being conversational and ideas and propositions-driven in style, so less formal? The latter type of talk doesn't mean, of course, that you don't have a structure. It just means that your structure is going to be different from the type of talk which is a formal, information-driven presentation. My third and final tip for public speaking: stories. Stories are crucial. Yep, stories. It's usually the case that stories can make or break your content and your purpose. 10 to 15 years ago, I used to speak to clients about legal updates, and these were professional clients, and I was intimidated with capital letters and underlined and in bold. You see, in my mind, every single person in that audience knew way more than I did. Who was I to stand up and speak to them about, TUVs, transactions at an undervalue, or preference payments? I slip into legal jargon, but that's the measure of how technical these topics were and still are. To me, especially in those early years, those early days of practice, when everyone knew more than I did, what did I know? So I had huge quantities, swathes of imposter syndrome flooding me whilst I prepared the talk, whilst I delivered the talk, and then my most nightmarish part of any of those legal talks, the whole event, the end of the talk. That this isn't where you can, sort of listen to the polite claps and just go and sit down and hide. No, this is where I would wait with bated breath, holding my breath, hoping that no one would ask a question, let alone a question I didn't understand or know the answer to. Oh gosh, getting chills down my spine just thinking back to those days. But yeah, that was me. Someone for whom public speaking was their living, still is. Back then, hating public speaking? Well, in that context anyway. Had I known then what I have since learned, I would probably have had fewer anxiety-filled days and sleepless nights in the lead up to these dreaded talks. Some of my fellow barristers actually refused to give these talks, so at least I was brave enough to stand up and give it a go. But was I any good at delivering these specialist talks on insolvency law? Was I heck? I remember in one of my talks, there were about 100 to 120 people in the room. At least 5 of them fell asleep, and at least 2 of them were snoring. Snoring. And I think 3 people even got up and left. I know, I've remembered. I can visualize them now, getting up and leaving, looking awkward, trying not to make eye contact with me. That's how good I was at public speaking. But see what I just did there? I told you a story. And I bet you that if you remember nothing else from today's episode, if you decide to tune off and listen to some music now or listen to a different podcast, you will remember how all of those people fell asleep in the middle of my really important talk on insolvency law. So how could I have worked towards preventing those people from falling asleep and those other people from leaving? Well, firstly, I should have asked myself, what was their purpose in coming to my talk? And that would have determined what the purpose of my talk was. They were there mostly to get professional development points. Had I kept that in mind, that would have helped with my low self-confidence around speaking to that audience. I mean, they weren't there to qualify for a degree and listen to a university professor. They were there simply to get CPD points. And all I had to do was give them, 2 to 3 bits of information that they could take away with them whilst trying to keep everything interesting. That would have been enough, more than enough. Then I should have asked myself, what about the content? It wasn't strictly true, you see, that they all knew more than I did. Had I given myself more credit that I was able to speak to my specialist topic in the context of a case that I had just worked on in court, and in the context of a series of cases that had had judgment handed down, where I had actually written quite a good quality article for a professional publication, had I maintained my focus on that unique perspective that I was bringing to the table and focused a lot less, on the audience members all being from the old boys club, which the majority of them were, of course, that would have really helped with my low self-confidence around speaking to that audience. And then, what about stories? I knew nothing about stories back then, even though every single legal case has a story behind it, because every single legal case has people behind them. The best way to liven up and deliver a technical and dry topic, on any topic in fact, with a bit more colour and pizzazz, is to tell stories. Had I told a few more of those around the facts of those cases, even that would have made people sit up and engage just a little bit more. And hopefully not fall asleep or leave. So let's dive into each core area a little bit more, starting with purpose. Ask yourself the following questions. What is the purpose of your talk, presentation, or workshop? Why are you there? Have you been asked to entertain or to persuade or to inform, or a combination of these purposes perhaps? And if when you ask yourself these questions, the answers don't come to you, then ask questions of the people asking you to give the talk. Then ask yourself, who is your audience? To what demographic are you speaking? Are your audience members subject matter experts in your field or some other field? Or are they there to learn from you as the expert? As part of the purpose of your talk, you will need to know your audience. Know who they are and why are they there? Are they there to glean learning from you? Are they there to listen to an idea that you have? Are they there simply to gain professional qualifying points? Do you have a mixed audience where people are there for a variety of different reasons? Once you know more about why you are giving your talk or presentation and to whom, you'll be able to build up from there. So going back to my performance, giving the talk on insolvency law, where at least 5 people fell asleep, had I given any thought to why my audience was there? No. Had I considered what they might find interesting or useful or somehow expansive to their current knowledge? No, of course not. Should I have thought about those things? Absolutely, yes, I should have. Part of the purpose of your talk is to know your audience. So know your audience, research them, imagine who they are or who they might be, visualize them, then visualize them listening to you. As part of this, when you're actually up there giving your talk or presentation, speak to the person every single time. When you get up to speak to anyone, whether that's on a stage with a real-life audience in front of you, or whether that's you in front of a camera recording a podcast, for example, whatever the context of your audience, speak to the person in front of you. In the absence of a live audience, such as with a podcast, the way you do that is you visualize them. You imagine your audience member, perhaps just one person, an imaginary person, looking, listening, perhaps even making notes, absorbing what you're saying. And that's also the case when you're on stage, where the lights on stage are so bright that you can't see a thing in front of you other than being blinded by the lights. Even then, have a visual image of an audience member. When I find myself in that kind of situation, the type of audience member I like to have in my mind's eye when I'm speaking there is where that person is someone with kind eyes, someone who appears obviously engaged and is listening, absorbing and taking in what I'm saying, perhaps even nodding in encouragement. Remember with this one, your audience is there listening to you because they want to be, especially with something like a podcast. There are so many options now of what people can listen to. It's so much easier to switch off or flick the channel or jump to another podcast than it is to actually stay listening and engaged. Your audience is there because they want to be, so connect with them, even if that means through visualization of a made-up person. In front of real-life audiences where you can see them because you have the kind of lighting which allows you to see at least a few rows in the audience, hone in on about, between 3 to 5 of that kind of person. That kind of person being the person who appears to be kind and engaged and encouraging and is looking up at you and, as I say, perhaps even nodding. And periodically make eye contact with them. Don't eyeball them and make them you feel uncomfortable and stay glued on their eyes. No, don't do that because that's just going to make you both feel uncomfortable. Just glance between those chosen members of the audience in order to maintain engagement and eye contact. My exception to the eye contact rule is when you're talking about something that's emotional and you know that by making eye contact with another human being, you will start crying. In that scenario, just look above the audience's head, assuming you can see them. Most conference rooms and auditoriums have a brightly lit exit sign right at the back of the room that you'll be facing from the stage frontwards. And if not an exit sign, there will likely be a clock or some other form of timer, usually giving you your countdown for how long you have left. If you feel that making eye contact will lead you to start crying or will really make you nervous, perhaps you're just starting out and this is your first time on stage and it's in front of people you know, and for me that's always worse than when I speak in front of strangers, then just look out above the audience's head towards the exit sign or towards the clock or timepiece. And if none of those things appear at the back of the room, then again, use your imagination. Imagine them there in your mind's eye. If you had designed that room, where would you put the exit sign or clock? Then focus your eyes there. Okay, so moving on to content. You know your purpose for speaking, why you're there. You've worked out who your audience is and also hopefully why they're there. The next thing that will help you bring your work together is the content of your talk and structuring the content of your talk. The best way to formulate your content is to be of service to your audience. Ask yourself, whilst you're in the early stages of preparing your talk, ask yourself, how can I best serve them? They are there, giving you their time and their money. How can you best serve them? What do they want? Or even better, what do they need? As people, sometimes we don't really know what we need. I know that's certainly true of me from time to time. A part of being in service is to know the difference also between perspective and perception. Okay, so in this context, perspective is your perspective. It's what you believe to be true. It could be about anything, politics or history or a topic where people have lots of opinions. Perception, on the other hand, is what other people believe to be true, what your audience holds as their truth. So with that in mind, start thinking about your topic from your audience's point of view, not yours. What do they want to know about? What do they need to know about in the context of your topic? For example, if one of my listeners likes to tune in to my episodes where I speak about motivation or maintaining self-confidence, it's unlikely that they will be here now listening to this episode on tips for public speaking, unless they want that specific guidance, of course. As another example, if you're at a conference which is about climate change, it's a fair bet to say that the audience will not want to hear about you speak about self-confidence. I use really obvious examples, but let's hone in on that a little bit more. And staying with the theme of self-confidence. Assume that that is what you are there to talk about. You've worked out that your demographic comprises, let's say, women starting out in business. That means you'll address the issue of confidence and self-confidence to the woman who has a startup. So ask yourself, what kind of hurdles will she be facing? How will she go about writing her first business plan? What kind of doubts, fears, anxieties, worries might she have? The answers to those questions in the context of early female entrepreneurship is going to be very different to the answers to those questions in the context of talking to, say, high school students about confidence in preparing for and sitting exams and going off to universities and colleges. So put yourself in your audience's shoes, in their seat. Address what is important to them, and then your content is going to be on fire. And now, structure. Okay, so you've thought about your content from your audience's point of view, from a place of how they will perceive what you're saying, taking account of their needs. You're already winning and you're on your way to delivering an impactful talk. Next, you will need a structure that flows. And again, this will depend on your audience and the type of content that you have, the type of talk that you have, the purpose that for you being there, for them being there. You may wish to take a chronological approach. If you're talking about a series of events, let's say in our shared human history. Or, and this may make things a little bit livelier, you may wish to take your topic by themes, make it thematic. When I've spoken about my Hurricane Irma experience, I have taken it by theme. As an example, for one of my talks, I spoke about how the events made me feel. So in that instance, I speak to an event or a series of events, and then I describe what I felt before, during, and after the event or events. And I have pulled all that together to speak in the context of the importance of resilience training before a testing event enters a person's life, which of course doesn't have to be a natural disaster, it can be anything. Okay, now my favourite part. As part of your structure, this leads nicely on to my third core element of building an absolutely amazing talk or presentation, which is stories. Great content will always include stories along the way. I mean, you don't have to have lots and lots of stories, but just enough to make people sit up and listen. So again, to use another of my own examples, whenever I talk about resilience, not necessarily in the context of natural disasters, but it could just be resilience in the sense of day-to-day life. And whether that's to a live audience in a group together or one-on-one with someone where it's relevant, or here on this platform, on my show. When I'm speaking about resilience, I love to tell the story of Thomas Edison. And for my regular listeners, you're probably tired of hearing of this, so I'll keep it brief. But Edison, we know, one of the most prolific inventors of all time, famously said about all his failed inventions, of which he had many. About those, he said, "I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." And I also love to tell the story about how it took Edison somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 attempts, depending on what your source is for finding this information, to invent the filament. That is, to this day, inside every single traditional light bulb in every single home that has electricity. And the reason I tell that story in the context of resilience is to remind people on a journey to something great to never give up. Never give up. Had Edison given up, the light bulb would have taken longer to invent and come to the public for wider consumption before someone else no doubt would have picked it up and let there be light. A key point about telling stories is to make sure they are relevant. My Edison story wasn't relevant to how you do public speaking well, but it is relevant in the context of when I talk about resilience. So, for example, don't start telling the story about how you got your cat or how your dog can do this great new trick that you've taught it to do if it doesn't have a point and relevance in your talk. If your story lacks relevance, in fact, if any of your content lacks relevance, your audience will not be served, which goes back to the question you will have asked yourself earlier: how can I be of service to my audience? With an irrelevant story, they will be plain confused. So yes, just remember the purpose of your talk and then cater your stories to fit that purpose. And this is why stories are so important. The power of storytelling is so profound. There have been studies done where the brainwaves have been studied of the speaker and also of the audience to whom the speaker is speaking. The brainwaves are tracked throughout the course of the talk or the speech, and those studies have found that at the time the speaker is telling a story, the audience members' brainwaves are on the same or similar frequency to the speaker's. That's the power of human connection and therefore engagement through storytelling. To use another example for the lawyers out there, even for the non-lawyers out there, anyone who has ever studied a single bit of English law will remember the snail in the ginger beer. Yeah, the snail in the ginger beer. That gave rise to modern-day tort law and duties of care being placed upon us. But most people won't necessarily remember that the case is called Donahue and Stevenson. But you will remember the snail in the ginger beer, that story, because it's a good and memorable set of facts, not such a good story for the lady who found the snail in the ginger beer, but memorable nonetheless. Okay, so I've spoken about my 3 core tips for public speaking, and they are: know the purpose of your talk. That includes knowing your audience and their purpose for attending your talk. Have great content that serves your audience. Ask yourself, how may I serve my audience? And then structure your content by thinking about it from the perspective of the audience and what they need to hear. And then think about how to do that, chronologically, thematically, or something else, or perhaps a combination. And then finally, always have stories. Your stories can be the signposts of where you are going, so you can introduce a topic with a story. Or your stories can be part of the solution to the problem you're speaking about. For example, the story about Thomas Edison speaks to a problem that almost every human has faced at least once in their lives, trying and trying and trying and failing and failing and failing, and wanting to give up. And then what happens when you don't give up? So there you have it, ways in which you can improve your public speaking. If you like what you're listening to and what I say is helping you, which I really hope it is, please go ahead and rate, follow, and share my show. By doing that, you'll be helping me to reach more people who will also benefit from what you're benefiting from. And if you're listening on the radio on 89.1 FM, head on over to my podcast, Shuvra Deb With You, available for free and on demand on all the usual podcast platforms. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.